Every sword fight you have ever watched in a movie is a lie. Not exaggerated, not dramatized. A lie. Because in every one of those scenes, a steel blade slices through armor like it is made of tinfoil, and the guy in the metal suit drops. The real problem on a medieval battlefield was the exact opposite. Good armor was so effective that killing someone wearing it became one of the hardest tactical puzzles in military history. People spent centuries inventing increasingly awful ways to solve that puzzle, and most of them still failed. So the question is not really whether medieval armor protected you. It did. The better question is how well, against what, and why people eventually stopped wearing it if it worked so well. Let us start with what armor actually was, because most people get this wrong immediately. When you picture a medieval knight, you probably imagine a guy wrapped in shiny steel plates from head to toe. That image is accurate for about 1 century out of the roughly 500 years we call the medieval period, and it only applied to the wealthiest fighters on the field. For everyone else, armour looked very different. The dominant form of personal protection for most of the Middle Ages evolved through a long progression that people tend to collapse into a single image. In the 11th through 13th centuries, you mostly saw mail shirts worn over padded undergarments, with a coif of mail covering the head and neck. An 11th century knight might have a mail hauberk reaching to the knees, a padded garment underneath, a helmet and a shield. That was a well-equipped fighter for his era. The 14th century brought composite systems mixing mail with rigid iron or steel plates, riveted inside cloth garments, things like coats of plates and brigandines, plus separate pieces protecting the shins and thighs. These transitional harnesses looked messy and patchwork compared to what came later, but they represented a steady arms race between smiths and the weapons those smiths were trying to defeat. Near-full plate harnesses for the upper classes did not arrive until the 15th century, and even then, mail never disappeared. It stayed under and between the plates the entire time, covering armpits and groins and the inside of elbows where rigid steel could not go without locking the joint solid. Underneath everything, from the poorest foot soldier to the richest lord, sat some form of padded garment. Armour was a system with 3 layers working together, not a single piece of equipment. The most common armour across the entire medieval period was textile. Gambesons, jacks, achetons. These were thick padded garments made of anywhere from 10 to 30 layers of linen, quilted together into something that looked like a very aggressive winter coat. You might think cloth armour sounds like a joke. It was not. A 24-layer linen gambeson weighed far less than plate, cost a fraction of the price, and in controlled experiments it proved nearly immune to sword cuts. Sharp blades hitting a thick gambeson often failed to slice through to the body underneath. They limited wounds to shallow surface lacerations or bruises. Against arrows from a modern hunting bow, a 24-layer gambeson stopped broadhead arrows about halfway through the thickness. They never reached the body. Bodkin points barely stuck into the outer layers. Even a 12-layer gambeson, half the protection, was what researchers called life-saving against broadheads. 6 layers was clearly not enough against heavy arrows, but even that thinner garment slowed missiles and blunted impacts enough to matter. Against thrusts, performance was more variable. Narrow, stiff points like spearheads or specialised thrusting sword tips could sometimes push through textile layers, especially when the target was backed by a firm surface. The padding still reduced force transfer to the body and often prevented full-depth penetration, but a gambeson alone was not a guarantee against a determined spear thrust. For the average medieval soldier who could not afford anything made of metal, a good gambeson was the difference between dying on the field and walking home with bruises. Analysts who have studied the evidence emphasise that gambesons were very effective even as standalone armour, and that their popularity across centuries reflects practical battlefield performance, not desperation. Now stack mail on top of that. Mail armour, the interlinked iron or steel rings most people associate with early medieval knights, was more sophisticated than it looks at first glance. Quality examples were made from riveted rings, often alternating rows of solid punched rings and riveted ones. The riveted rings were formed from drawn wire bent into circles and closed with a tiny iron rivet through overlapping ends. Typical ring diameters in surviving historical hauberks are relatively small, often in the 6 to 8 mm internal diameter range with wire gauges that gave substantial metal cross-section. Each ring linked to 4 neighbours, creating a flexible mesh that could drape over the body's curves while presenting an interlocking metal barrier to incoming weapons. This matters because modern reproductions sold as costume pieces use butted rings, meaning rings that are simply pushed closed without rivets. Butted mail is dramatically weaker than the real thing. The rings pop open under any serious impact. Testing results from butted mail tell you about as much about medieval armour as testing a cardboard shield would tell you about a wooden one. Mail garments range from knee-length hauberks with integral sleeves and coifs covering the head and neck, common from the 11th through 13th centuries, to shorter haubergeons and localised mail voiders and aventails integrated into plate harnesses later on. A full hauberk was a serious piece of equipment that could weigh 10 to 15 kilograms on its own, all of it hanging from the shoulders unless belted at the waist. Riveted mail worn over a padded garment was extremely effective against cuts. Experimental cutting and stabbing on riveted mail backed by cloth consistently shows sword cuts failing to sever rings. The blade catches or glances, deforms a few rings at most, and the padding underneath absorbs whatever force gets through. In test after test, the simulated flesh underneath takes little or no damage from cutting attacks. Swords do not slice through mail. That is a fiction invented because audiences would get bored watching a guy bounce his sword off another guy for 20 minutes. Mail had a weakness though, and it was concentrated force. Narrow spear and dagger points could force rings apart or shear rivets, especially when a lot of energy was delivered to a small area. A strong spear thrust into mail backed by cloth often produced limited but real penetration, more like a puncture through the weave than a wide hole. Longbow arrows with proper bodkin heads could penetrate mail over limited padding, though often only shallowly, while mail over thicker padding could largely resist warbow arrows at typical battle ranges. Tests on riveted Viking-era mail show that heavy spear thrusts or powerful crossbow bolts could open rings and punch through, whereas many sword and arrow impacts failed or only partly penetrated. By the 14th and 15th centuries, mail increasingly served as secondary defence, covering joints and gaps between rigid plates at armpits, inner elbows, groin, and the back of knees, rather than as the primary torso armour. It remained essential because no realistic armour could cover every square centimetre of the body with thick plate without making movement impossible. Mail's flexibility allowed coverage of complex joints at acceptable weight, trading some vulnerability for the ability to actually bend your arms. This is why plate armour developed, not because mail was bad. Mail was excellent at what it did. Plate answered the threats that mail could not handle alone. By the 15th century, the wealthiest fighters on a European battlefield wore what amounted to a custom-fitted steel shell. A full plate harness covered you from head to toe in shaped steel plates. Breastplate and backplate, a fold and tassets protecting hips and upper thighs, full leg harness, articulated arm defences, gauntlets, and a visored helmet. Mail voiders covered the remaining gaps. Underneath sat a tailored arming doublet, padded and reinforced, with lacing points where each piece of armour attached. Those lacing points distributed weight evenly across the body and kept plates from shifting under impact. The metallurgy is where things get genuinely surprising. Alan Williams and other researchers have analysed surviving 15th century breastplates and found carbon contents and heat treatments comparable to early modern tool steels. This was not just iron hammered into shape. Late medieval armourers were producing medium carbon steel that was hardened and tempered to resist specific threats. They understood, whether through formal knowledge or generations of empirical trial and error, that how you heated and cooled steel changed its properties. A smith who quenched a breastplate in water or oil and then tempered it at the right temperature could produce steel that was hard enough to resist a blade, yet tough enough not to shatter on impact. The difference between a breastplate made of plain wrought iron and one made of properly heat-treated medium carbon steel was enormous in practice. The treated plate resisted penetration far more effectively because it was genuinely harder, not just thicker. A breastplate might measure 3 to 3.5 millimeters thick in the center front, tapering to around 1 to 1.5 millimeters at the sides. That taper was deliberate. You got a thick zone over your heart and lungs where incoming weapons were most likely to land, while thinner steel at the flanks saved weight. Curvature and ridges stamped into the surface increased effective thickness and encouraged glancing blows, sending incoming force sliding off to the side instead of driving straight in. Arm and leg plates were usually thinner, often around 1 to 1.5 millimeters in surviving originals, shaped to deflect and backed by padding and sometimes mail. Helmets, and visors could be locally thicker, since the head and face are priority targets and can tolerate more rigid mass. A complete field harness generally weighed around 25 to 32 kilograms, which is roughly 55 to 70 pounds. That sounds like a lot until you realise it was spread across every limb and anchored to a fitted garment underneath. A modern infantry soldier carrying a full combat load with body armour, weapon, ammunition, water, radio and pack routinely carries 30 to 50 kilograms, and most of that hangs from their shoulders and hips in a way that leaves the legs carrying all the stress. The medieval knight had his load distributed from ankles to scalp. Every joint bore its own share. The weight on any single body part was modest. This is why the image of knights being hoisted onto horses by cranes is complete nonsense. That myth comes partly from later jousting armour, which was specialised tournament gear weighing 40 to 50 kilograms or more, built absurdly thick in specific areas because it only needed to resist one type of attack from one direction. Jousting harnesses were not designed for battlefield mobility any more than a NASCAR roll cage is designed for parallel parking. Field armour was a different animal entirely. Experiments with historically accurate reproduction harnesses show trained wearers running, jumping, climbing ladders, rolling on the ground, and even performing somersaults. One well-known demonstration involved a man in full 15th century reproduction armour, doing a standing jump onto a horse from the ground without a stirrup. You could fight in this stuff. You could get up off the ground after being knocked down. You could climb a siege ladder, which is something men in full plate actually did on a regular basis during the period. The trade-off was not whether you could function. The trade-off was how fast you would tire out, and that trade-off was real. Physiological studies using replica 15th century armour measuring 30 to 50 kilograms showed that wearing a full harness roughly doubles the energy cost of walking or running. It also restricts breathing, because the breastplate limits how much your ribcage can expand. In cool weather on flat ground, a fit man in good armour could sustain combat for a reasonable stretch before exhaustion set in. In hot weather, in mud, on a slope, the clock started ticking much faster. This will matter enormously when we get to Agincourt. Now the thing everyone argues about, arrows. This debate has been going on for decades and generates more heat than almost any other question in medieval military history. Could an English longbow arrow punch through plate armour? The short answer is, usually not if the plate was good. The longer answer requires looking at a lot of experimental data, because people have actually tested this repeatedly under controlled conditions. The Arrows vs Armour tests run by Todd Todeschini used a 160-pound warbow, firing 80-gram arrows at a reproduction Cherbourg-style breastplate, 2.5mm thick in the centre and tapering to 1.5mm at the edges, worn over mail and textile layers. At distances of 10 to 25 metres, arrows hitting the thick central zone dented the plate severely, and sometimes cracked it. They passed through the mail and cloth behind the plate, and slightly penetrated the ballistic gel standing in for flesh. They did not punch clean holes. The arrows themselves were frequently destroyed by the impact, crumpling and shattering against the steel. The plate won, but it did not win cleanly. It took real damage. Other tests tell variations of the same story. Compilations of 14 independent warbow versus plate tests show a consistent pattern. Breastplates of 2 to 2.5mm in mild or low-carbon steel generally resist complete perforation by warbow arrows. Where penetration does occur, it tends to happen in thinner sections around 1.5mm, or at very close range with extremely heavy arrows. Against properly hardened medium-carbon steel, of the kind the best 15th century armourers were producing, the numbers tilt even further in armour's favour. Longbow tests with hardened linen gambesons alone recorded arrow penetrations of several centimetres, enough to wound but far less than bare flesh would suffer, especially when combined with mail. The combination of plate over mail over padding created a defence that arrows from even powerful warbows struggled to defeat at the centre of the chest. Tests on a fully equipped harness showed almost binary results. Hits squarely on plate were largely stopped with dents. Hits landing on mail voiders or openings were far more likely to penetrate through to the body. So arrows did not go through good plate. That is the experimental consensus, and medieval accounts agree. Chronicles describing Agincourt mention arrows rattling off French knights like hail on a roof. The sound must have been something close to terrifying if you were on the receiving end. thousands of steel-tipped shafts slamming into your armour at once, a metallic roar across a muddy field in northern France in October 1415. The French still lost, not because arrows punched through their breastplates, but because the arrows found other targets. Horses went down screaming, dumping their riders into the mud. Arrows struck limbs protected by thinner plates and sometimes got through. They found gaps at joints and visors, mail at armpits and inner elbows. Even when arrows failed to wound, the psychological and physical effect of walking into an intense arrow storm should not be underestimated. Thousands of impacts hammering your armour, your visor slitted so narrow you can barely see, every step forward another volley landing around you. The noise alone would have been disorienting. Some men would have stopped or turned, others would have pressed on and arrived at the English line with their nerves shredded and their legs burning. Beyond the wounds and the fear, there was the exhaustion problem. French men-at-arms advanced on foot across wet, torn-up ground in full armour, some of them for hundreds of metres. The field had been freshly ploughed. It had rained. The mud was deep enough that men were sinking in past their ankles. By the time they reached the English line, many were barely able to lift their weapons. The armour that protected them from arrows also burned through their energy reserves at double the normal rate, and the sucking mud made every step cost twice again what it should have. Once they were disordered and spent, lighter English infantry closed in with polearms and daggers, targeting gaps, wrestling armoured men to the ground, and finishing them with thrusts into visors and armpits. Some French knights who fell in the mud and could not rise were simply held down and suffocated under the weight of their own armour and the bodies piling on top of them. Armour did not fail at Agincourt. It forced the English to find every way around it, and the ways they found were brutal. Battles like Crécy in 1346 and Poitiers in 1356 tell similar stories. Plate-armoured men were not easily killed by arrows striking their torsos, but their horses were vulnerable, their less armoured limbs were vulnerable, and once dismounted and stuck in unfavourable terrain while tired, they were at the mercy of lighter troops who knew where the gaps were. This pattern repeats across the entire medieval period. Every time protection improved, weapons adapted. When mail became common, crossbows got more powerful and lances got heavier. When plate appeared, edged weapons became almost useless against a well-armoured opponent. You cannot cut through curved, hardened steel with a sword. The blade skids off and leaves a scratch. The person inside barely notices. Medieval fighting manuals reflect this with fascinating honesty. They stopped teaching people how to cut through armour because it could not be done. Instead, they taught half-swording, where you grip the blade of your longsword with one hand near the tip and use the point like a short spear, driving it into gaps at armpits, visor slits, groins, or between plates at joints. They taught the murder stroke, Mordau in German, where you flip the sword around and strike with the crossguard or pommel like a hammer against the helmet or knee joints. They taught grappling and wrestling techniques designed to throw an armoured opponent to the ground, so you could pin them and finish with a rondel dagger through a weak spot. Experimental tests of half-sword thrusts into 1.6mm steel show that, while very forceful thrusts can dimple or occasionally pierce thin, mild steel, getting through hardened and correctly shaped plate at good angles is extremely difficult. Targeting gaps was far more reliable than trying to go through the plate itself. Consider what that means. The sword, the weapon most associated with medieval combat, became a specialised tool for exploiting a few inches of vulnerability in an otherwise complete defensive system. Against a well-armoured opponent, the best use of a longsword was often as a lever for wrestling him to the ground. Spears in infantry combat could deliver powerful thrusts, especially when braced or used in tight formations where multiple men pushed against a single target. Against plate, they faced the same limitations as thrusting swords, but benefited from reach and mass. A strong spear thrust could occasionally spread mail rings and penetrate some padding, or slip into gaps at armpits or between plates, but it rarely punched through sound plate steel. On horseback, lances delivered enormous energy. The combined momentum of a horse and rider concentrated onto a narrow point was devastating enough that the response was not just heavier armour, but specially reinforced jousting harnesses, often much thicker than field armour, designed to absorb that specific kind of impact. Even with those lances, the goal against a fully armoured mounted opponent was often to unhorse or stun rather than to transfix the torso. Getting a man off his horse and onto the ground was usually more effective than trying to punch a lance through his breastplate. As plate armour improved, shields actually became less necessary for fully armoured cavalry and heavy infantry. If your body was already encased in steel, carrying a heavy shield on one arm was dead weight that could be replaced by a two-handed weapon with more reach and hitting power. This is why poleaxes and two-handed swords grew in prominence during the same period that full plate became widespread. Lighter infantry, with only partial armour, gambesons and bits of mail and simple plates, still benefited enormously from their protection. It was not plate harness, but it still improved survival odds against massed missile fire, polearm pushes, and close-quarters stabbing. This is why purpose-built anti-armour weapons became so popular. Poleaxes combined an axe or hammerhead, a spike, and hooks on a long haft. They gave you leverage for powerful overhead strikes, and the ability to hook an opponent's limbs and drag them off balance. A poleaxe fight between two armoured men was less like a sword duel and more like a violent wrestling match punctuated by hammer blows to the head. The hooks and spikes were as important as the striking surface, because once you could control your opponent's weapon or grab his limb, you could force him into a position where you could deliver a targeted blow or throw him to the ground. Warhammers and maces concentrated force on tiny contact areas. They did not try to cut through armour. They tried to dent it inward against the body, break bones through the steel, or concuss the person inside by transmitting shock through the helmet into the skull. A flanged mace head hitting a helmet at full force was delivering all its energy through an area smaller than a coin. The steel of the helmet might hold, but the skull behind it still absorbed an enormous impact. Experimental tests confirm that mace strikes can deform plate in ways dangerous to the wearer, especially when repeated blows land in the same area. You might not bleed, but your arm or your ribs might not work anymore. The bruising from repeated mace impacts through plate could be severe enough to incapacitate even when the armour itself remained intact. Historical sources and modern analysis agree that against plate, these weapons aim to concuss, dent, or break the person inside the shell rather than breaking the shell itself. Crossbows presented another category of threat entirely. Powerful 15th and 16th century crossbows with steel prods achieved draw weights of 600 to over 1,000 pounds and delivered significantly higher energies than most bows. Where a warbow might send an arrow downrange at perhaps 100 to 150 joules, a heavy crossbow bolt could carry considerably more, and it arrived on a flatter trajectory with less warning. Experimental tests with heavy crossbows show bolts penetrating thinner plates of about 1.5 millimeters and mail more readily than arrows, sometimes punching through plate and partially entering the ballistic medium behind. High-quality late medieval plate that had been proofed against crossbows fared better. Dents and cracks, but not full perforations at longer ranges. The proofing process itself is worth understanding because it tells you how seriously armourers and their customers took the threat. A finished breastplate would be set up and shot with a crossbow bolt or, later, a handgun ball at close range. If the bolt or ball dented the steel without going through, the armour passed. The smith then left the dent visible and stamped a proof mark into the steel next to it. That dent and mark were advertising. A buyer examining a breastplate in an armourer's shop could look at the proof mark and know that the piece had been tested against a real weapon and survived. Armour without a proof mark cost less and protected less. You got what you paid for, and the proof mark was the medieval equivalent of a safety certification stamped right into the product. Then came firearms, and the entire calculation shifted. Early 15th century Hussite handguns delivered around 500 to 1,000 joules of muzzle energy using serpentine powder. A 16th century arquebus pushed that to roughly 1,300 joules with serpentine and about 1,750 with the newer corned powder. A heavy musket from the same period could deliver 2,300 joules with serpentine and up to 3,000 joules with corned powder. For comparison, a heavy warbow arrow carries somewhere around 100 to 150 joules. The heaviest muskets were delivering 20 times the energy of a warbow arrow, from a weapon that required weeks of training instead of years. Good proofed armour could still stop early arquebus or pistol shots at typical combat ranges. Period documents describe this explicitly. One Elizabethan English source noted that heavy muskets could kill a man in proof armour at 100 yards, a man in common armour at 400 yards, and an unarmoured man at 600 yards. That layering of protection tells you both how lethal firearms were becoming and how much good armour still helped even against guns. Calculations based on Williams' work suggest 2mm of quality steel plate could resist lower energy handgun rounds at distance, but stopping a heavy musket ball required plates on the order of 4mm thick or more. At that thickness, a full-body harness becomes something no human being can carry into a fight. This is why armour contracted rather than vanishing overnight. Through the late 16th and 17th centuries, soldiers went from full harness to breastplates and helmets for cavalry, then gradually to nothing for most infantry. The cost and weight of making armour musket-proof for the entire body exceeded what was practical, especially when firearms kept getting more powerful with every generation. Infantry tactics shifted to large pike and shot formations where volume of fire mattered more than individual protection. It no longer made economic sense to spend a small fortune encasing one man in enough steel to stop a musket ball, when you could buy several muskets for the same price and put them in the hands of men who needed only weeks of training to use them. Spherical lead balls also lose energy quickly in flight and deform on impact with hardened steel, which meant that at range, effective penetration was often significantly lower than muzzle energy numbers would suggest. Armour remained genuinely useful against firearms at distance well into the 17th century. Cavalry cuirasses could stop pistol shots at typical engagement ranges. Siege engineers and sappers wore heavy breastplates specifically because they worked against the small arms fire they were likely to face. The decline was gradual and uneven, not the clean break that popular history likes to present. People sometimes read that decline as proof that armour never really worked. That gets the story backwards. Armour's disappearance was a response to gunpowder weapons becoming too powerful, too accurate, and too cheap. Swords and arrows never beat plate. Gunpowder did, and even then it took more than a century for the full transition. Forensic archaeology from medieval battlefield sites rounds out the picture in ways that are both grim and informative. Injury patterns on skeletal remains match what the experimental data predicts. Arrow lesions on bones are relatively rare and tend to cluster on limbs or heads, the areas where armour was thinnest or absent. Many injuries are from blunt trauma or hacking wounds where armour was missing. A significant number of fatal wounds appear to have been delivered after an opponent was knocked down, pinned, or partially disabled. The pattern suggests that most killing in armoured combat happened in two phases. First, you wore the other person down or knocked them over. Then you finished them while they were on the ground and could not protect their gaps. No practical armour can cover every joint and opening without destroying mobility. Even the best 15th century harnesses have small exposed or lightly protected areas at the armpits, even when partly covered by mail voiders. The inner elbows, back of the knees, groin and inner thighs, the neck and lower face around the visor and bevor, the palm sides of hands, finger joints, and sometimes the soles of the feet. Armour design constantly balanced coverage against the need to actually move. Hips, shoulders, and thighs received complex overlapping plates, but they never became a rigid shell because the joints underneath them had to bend. Every articulation point was a compromise between protection and function. Those compromises were small, often just a few inches of mail-covered or lightly covered area, but a skilled opponent with a pointed weapon knew exactly where to look for them. Two armoured men fighting each other could trade blows for a surprisingly long time, with neither suffering a serious wound. The armour worked. The fight ended when someone got tired, tripped, got hooked by a poleaxe, or ended up face down in the dirt with a dagger probing for the gap between helmet and collar. The outcomes were often binary. A solid hit either failed completely, leaving nothing worse than a bruise, or it found a gap and caused a serious injury. There was surprisingly little middle ground between fine and finished. Medieval plate armour was not the decorative costume that popular culture pretends. A full late medieval harness worn over mail and padding was one of the most effective personal protection systems ever built before the modern era. It did not make you invincible. It made you very hard to kill with anything short of specialised weapons, physical exhaustion, or a precise strike into one of the few remaining gaps in a steel shell that covered nearly every inch of your body. The arms race between armour and weapon-shaped tactics, fighting techniques, and battlefield outcomes for the better part of 5 centuries. And armour lost that race only when gunpowder delivered more energy than steel could stop at a weight a human being could carry. Some version of that same contest is still going on right now. Ceramic plates and Kevlar in place of forged steel. Rifle cartridges in place of musket balls. The materials changed, the math did not.